One line from humanity ended all talks. The Galactic Council was stunned. The stylus was already on the table when I walked in. That is the first thing I noticed. Not the cathedral ceiling carved from asteroid rock, not the 1,000 floating crests of alien civilizations spinning slowly above the gallery, not the 6-meter holographic projection of my own face beaming to every connected world in the known galaxy. The stylus, sitting there like a period at the end of a sentence that had already been written for me. My name is Yara Osai. I am 34 years old. I grew up in Accra, studied law and xenodiplomacy at the University of Cape Coast, and 3 years ago I was appointed as Earth's ambassador to the Veth Conclave Station, the most powerful intergovernmental body in this region of the galaxy. I was not appointed because I was the best. I was appointed because every senior diplomat we had either retired after the previous failed negotiation or refused the post outright. I was the one who said yes when no one else would. I remember the briefing clearly. Director Lynn sat across from me in the gray conference room in Geneva. She did not offer tea. She opened a folder, slid it across the table, and said, "The Council has issued a formal summons, not an invitation, a summons. They want Earth to answer for the second warship." The second warship, that is what started all of this. 14 months earlier, Earth had completed construction of a second interstellar military vessel. The first one, the Resolution, had been built 7 years prior and registered with the Council under the Mutual Defense Framework. But the second ship, the one the press called the Harbor Light, was built in secret at a lunar dry dock, not because we were hiding aggression, because we were afraid. There had been 3 separate border incidents in the outer colonies in the past 2 years, and the Council had responded to each of them with delays, review committees, and carefully worded statements about proportional restraint. Meanwhile, our people on those stations were going without supply runs, without protection, without any certainty that help would come if things got worse. So we built a second ship, and someone talked, and here I was. The Council chamber aboard the Veth Conclave Station is not designed to make you feel equal. It is designed, intentionally, to make you feel small. The ceiling rises 90 meters above the central floor. The delegate seats are arranged in concentric rings, each row higher than the last, so that the presiding arbiter sits at the very top, looking down at you from a position that was clearly meant to communicate something. At the center of the chamber, at the lowest point, is a single round platform with a single chair and a single microphone. That is where the accused sits. I was the accused. I walked down the aisle slowly, because walking fast would have looked like fear and walking slow would have looked deliberate. I aimed for calm and mostly achieved it, except for my hands, which I kept flat against my sides because I did not want anyone watching the broadcast to see them shake. The gallery was full. Every delegation had sent representatives. The Lure occupied the east quadrant, their pale, translucent heads tilted at angles that conveyed attention. The Verk Dominion filled 2 full rows in the upper ring, armored even here, even in a chamber where weapons were technically prohibited. The observers, a species whose name translated roughly as those who record, sat completely motionless in the far tier, their recording filaments extended, capturing everything. There were no humans in the gallery. Not one. Earth's application to hold observer status at Council sessions was still under review. It had been under review for 11 years. I sat down in the single chair on the central platform. The microphone hummed. Above me, the holographic text shifted to display the heading of the proceedings in 14 languages, including English. It read, "Formal inquiry, unauthorized military escalation species. Human designation. Earth provisional member status, case number 7741C. I had read every page of my briefing folder on the shuttle over. 4,112 pages. Testimonies, legal precedents, historical records of similar cases, outcome analysis for 17 comparable situations. The conclusion of the analysis was consistent across all 17. species in Earth's position with Earth's level of council standing always accepted the terms offered. Always. The alternative was collective economic and logistical sanctions that would effectively isolate us from interstellar trade routes, medical supply chains, and the communications relay network that held our outer colonies in contact with home. My instructions from Earth's Joint Council were clear: apologize, defer to the Council's judgment, accept whatever inspection and disarmament framework they proposed, preserve Earth's standing, do not escalate, do not make enemies, survive the hearing and come home. I had read those instructions 3 times on the shuttle. I understood them completely. Then I had opened a new document on my datapad, written 1 sentence, and set the briefing folder face down on the seat beside me. High Arbiter Thesov opened the session with the formal reading of charges. Thesov was Verk by species, but had served as Arbiter for 60 years, which was long enough that most delegates regarded him as neutral, even though neutrality is always a story someone tells about power. His voice came through the translation system as deep and precise, each word landing like a stamp. The charges were unauthorized military construction, failure to register a warship under the Mutual Defense Framework, breach of the Provisional Membership Compact, and conduct demonstrating willful disregard for collective security protocols. He read each one. The chamber listened. I listened. When he finished, he looked down at the central platform directly at me and said in the formal phrasing of conclave procedure, "The representative of the human species is invited to offer response." I looked back up at him. I did not touch the prepared statement on my datapad. I picked up the stylus from the table. Not to sign anything, just to hold it because my hands had started to move again, and holding something still kept the rest of me still too. I thought about the night before. I had sat in my quarters on the station with the lights low and the viewport open, watching the stars. There are more stars visible from Veth Conclave Station than from anywhere on Earth because there is no atmosphere between you and them, no weather, no light pollution from cities below. They were very clear and very cold and very far away, and they had no opinion whatsoever about what happened to us. I had closed the briefing folder. I had opened the new document. And I had written the sentence. 1 sentence, 22 words. I looked at it one more time before I stood up to speak. Then I set the datapad down, stood up from the chair on the central platform, and looked up at High Arbiter Thesov with all 214 civilizations watching, and I opened my mouth. The Verk representative spoke first, as I knew he would. His name was Senior Delegate Orath, and he had been the Council's loudest voice on the Earth question for the past 2 years. Orath was not subtle about his position. He believed that provisional member species should be treated like candidates, not participants, and that candidates who broke the rules should be removed from candidacy entirely. He had said this in 3 prior council sessions, on record, in language so clear that even the translation systems did not need to smooth it. He rose from his seat in the upper ring before Thesov had even formally opened the floor for statements. That itself was a procedural violation, but Thesov allowed it, which told me everything I needed to know about how the session was going to be run. Orath spoke for 14 minutes. I counted. He began with the treaty history, specifically the Mutual Defense Framework signed 40 years ago when Earth first achieved interstellar capability. Under that framework, any species seeking Council membership was required to register all military vessels above a certain mass threshold, submit to biannual inspection, and receive Council approval before expanding their fleet beyond an agreed baseline. Earth had signed this framework voluntarily as a condition of provisional membership. We had understood the terms. What Orath was very careful to do was strip out every piece of context. He did not mention that the inspection schedule had slipped 4 times in the past 3 years because the Council's inspection corps was understaffed and the Verk Dominion, which controlled the largest share of inspection ships, kept reassigning them to Dominion Border Patrol. He did not mention that Earth's 3 requests to expand our registered fleet had been submitted through proper channels and were still sitting in a review committee that had not met in 8 months. He did not mention the border incidents at the outer colonies, or the supply shortages, or the 18 months our people on Callaway Station had spent without a confirmed security guarantee while the council deliberated. He mentioned none of this. What he mentioned was our failure to comply, our secrecy, our disregard, our presumption in making a unilateral decision that affected collective security. He used the word unilateral 11 times. Again, I counted. When he finished, he sat down, and Thesov opened the floor for additional statements. 4 more delegations spoke. The Lure delegate offered what was technically a neutral position, but was delivered in language so gentle and sorrowful that it functioned as a soft endorsement of the charges. The 2 mid-tier delegations from the outer arm added procedural commentary. Then the representative of the observers stood up, extended 2 of their recording filaments toward me, and said nothing. They held the silence for 30 seconds and then sat back down. That was apparently a statement. By the time Thesov turned to me again and said, "The human representative is now invited to present Earth's formal response," the shape of the session was already clear. This was not a trial. Trials have uncertainty. This was a ratification. The council had already decided what was going to happen. They had already drafted the framework. They were here today to watch me accept it. Thesov slid the ratification tablet across the dais toward my platform. I watched it stop at the edge, balanced there, the stylus lying alongside it on a small tray. The framework document on the tablet was 38 pages. I had been given a preview copy the night before. It required Earth to stand down the harbor light pending a full weapons inspection. It required us to submit to council-supervised monitoring of our shipyards for the next decade. It required us to accept a formal fleet cap of 1 registered vessel until our provisional membership was upgraded to full standing, which the council would review in 50 years. 50 years. My grandmother was 81 years old. She lived in a small house outside of Kumasi, and she grew tomatoes in her backyard, and she had never once in her life asked anyone's permission to grow them. I stood up. The chamber settled into the particular quality of silence that happens when a room full of beings that have been talking for a long time suddenly realizes that the person they have been talking about is going to say something they did not prepare for. I did not touch the tablet. I did not pick up the stylus. I looked up at Orath first, because he deserved to hear this directly, and then I looked at Thesov. And then I looked at the full ring of the gallery, all 214 delegations, all those eyes and filaments and sensor arrays, and whatever the observers used to perceive the world, and I said the sentence. The translation field carried it simultaneously in every registered language of the conclave. I heard it going out in waves, one pulse, clean and clear, into every corner of that 90-meter chamber. 22 words. We have been to the bottom of our own extinction and come back, so tell me, Arbiter, exactly what it is you think you can threaten us with. The silence afterward was not like the silence before. The silence before had been expectant, orderly, the silence of a room waiting for a formality. The silence after was something else entirely. It was the silence of a room that had just heard a sound it did not have a category for. It was the silence of beings trying to run a translation through a second time, because the first pass could not possibly have been correct. Orath's translation bead flickered. I saw it from across the chamber. It flickered twice, which meant the translation system had flagged the sentence for contextual review. A flickering bead meant that the literal words had come through, but the emotional weight, the cultural register, the specific freight of what the words actually meant coming from a human mouth in this chamber on this day, had not yet resolved into something the system could classify. The lure delegate's secondary eyelid closed. I had read enough about lure biology to know that the secondary eyelid closed involuntarily in response to unexpected perceptual input. It was the lure equivalent of blinking in surprise. One of the observers extended a third recording filament. They only had 2 out before. The third was reserved, according to everything I had read, for moments of what they classified as historical significance. Thesov looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then he said, in the most carefully controlled voice I had heard from him all session, "The chamber will take a recess of 1 standard hour." A recess. In 60 years as arbiter, according to the conclave record I had studied, Thesov had called a procedural recess 3 times, once for a medical emergency in the gallery, once when the translation system failed during a particularly complex multilateral session, once when a delegate from the Voreth Collective had experienced a public breakdown and needed to be escorted out. He had never called a recess, because a delegate said something he did not know how to respond to. I sat back down in the chair on the central platform, while the chamber began to move around me, delegates rising, voices starting up low and urgent in a dozen languages, the gallery buzzing with the particular frequency of a room full of beings who had expected one thing and received something completely different. I set the stylus down on the tablet, still unsigned. I looked up at the ceiling, at the turning crests of 214 civilizations. I thought, good, now we are actually having a conversation. The sentence, all 22 words of it, was not a bluff. That is the most important thing I need you to understand before I explain what happened next. It was not bravado. It was not a diplomatic gambit calculated to shock the room into a better negotiating position, although if that was a side effect, I was not going to complain. It was a fact, the most compressed, most honest fact I could fit into a single breath. But facts need context to land, and the Council, for all its libraries and records and observer filaments capturing everything in 14 dimensions, did not have the context for that sentence. Not really. They had data. Data and context are not the same thing. Let me give you the context. 119 years before I walked into that chamber, the Earth entered what historians now call the dying century. It did not begin with one event. It began the way most catastrophes begin, with many small failures that everyone assumed someone else was managing. The climate shifted faster than the models had predicted. The ocean systems destabilized. Crop yields in the primary agricultural zones fell 40% in 11 years. Freshwater reserves in Central Asia, North Africa, and the American Southwest dropped below sustainable thresholds. Governments that had promised solutions for decades discovered that the solutions required sacrifices that their populations would not accept, and so they chose the sacrifices their populations could not prevent instead, which meant the sacrifices landed on the poor, on the margins, on the people who were already carrying the most weight. By the time the first major resource conflict began in the Central Asian corridor, 600 million people were already living in conditions that the old humanitarian frameworks classified as crisis-level deprivation. And the conflict, once it started, spread the way fire spreads in a dry season, not because people wanted it to, but because the systems that were supposed to stop it were built for a world that no longer existed. I will not give you the numbers all at once, because numbers above a certain scale stop meaning anything. The mind does not know how to hold them. What I will tell you is that the dying century included 3 major pandemics, 2 nuclear detonations in contested border zones, 4 collapsed regional governments, 17 years of what historians call the silent decade, which was not actually a decade, and was not actually silent, but was the period in which global communication networks fragmented badly enough that vast regions of the Earth lost reliable contact with one another. 2.3 billion people. That is the accepted count of the lives lost in that period from all causes combined: conflict, disease, famine, displacement. The specific cruelty of being a person in the wrong place when a system fails. Here is the part that matters for the sentence I said in that chamber. We did not receive help. At the time, humanity was not yet interstellar. We were barely interplanetary. We had a small station on the Moon, a research outpost on Mars, and a handful of deep space probes at the edge of the solar system. The Galactic Council, which at that point had been aware of our existence for nearly 30 years, had been monitoring our situation with what their official records described as concern. Delegations had been sent. Statements had been issued. There had been 3 separate council motions to offer technological assistance in the form of climate stabilization resources that we later learned the council had used successfully on 2 other worlds facing similar crises. All 3 motions failed. The Verk Dominion voted against each one on the grounds that direct intervention in a pre-member species' internal crisis set a precedent they were not willing to establish. They had enough votes to block it. So the council watched and recorded and expressed concern and did nothing, while 2.3 billion people died. And then, when the worst of it was over, when we had rebuilt enough to look up again, the Council's first formal outreach to Earth was an invitation to apply for provisional membership, as if nothing had happened, as if the watching had been a gift. We applied. Of course we applied. We needed the trade routes, the communication networks, the access to medical research that the Council controlled. We swallowed the history and we applied and we accepted the terms and we sent delegates and we registered our 1 warship and we filed our paperwork and waited 11 years for observer status that never came through. And then we built a 2nd ship because our people in the outer colonies were frightened and no one was coming for them. And here we were. No other species at that table had this history. The Lure had faced a solar event 400 years ago that threatened their home world, and the Council had provided evacuation ships within 60 days. The Voreth Collective had gone through a political collapse 2 centuries back, and the Council had sent economic stabilization teams and reconstruction support. The observers, whose origin history was almost entirely obscured, had been full members of the Council since before most current species had developed interstellar travel. Every species in that chamber had either never faced extinction-level pressure or had faced it with the Council at their back. We had faced it alone. And we had survived. Not cleanly, not without loss so vast it reshaped what it meant to be human, but we had survived. We had rebuilt the governments, reconnected the networks, recovered the food systems, reduced the conflicts, treated the sick, buried the dead in numbers so large we created new forms of memorial because the old ones were not built for that scale. We had done all of it ourselves, with nothing but our own stubbornness and the specific human unwillingness to stop. That is what the sentence meant. When Oreth stood up in that chamber and catalogued our violations and offered us a 50-year fleet cap, as though that was a punishment we would be afraid of, he was speaking to a species that had stared into the end of itself and rebuilt from the wreckage. He was brandishing consequences at beings who had already paid prices that would make his worst threats look modest. We were not brave. I want to be clear about that. Bravery implies you feel the fear and act anyway. What I felt standing on that platform was something different. Something closer to the feeling you get when a stranger threatens to take something from you that you have already lost and found again. It is not fearlessness. It is just a very precise understanding of what you actually have to lose. The chamber was in recess now, buzzing around me. And something was changing. The Lure delegate crossed the floor toward my platform. That alone was unusual. Floor movement during recess was allowed, but delegates from senior species rarely approached the accused platform informally. It implied too much. It looked like sympathy, or alliance, or interest, none of which the senior delegations usually wanted to display toward a provisional member on trial. The Lure delegate did not care. She came directly to me. Her name, as close as the translation system could render it, was something like Aylin, and she sat down on the edge of the platform without asking permission, which was extremely lure behavior, and looked at me with those pale, translucent eyes and said, "I am going to ask you something and I want you to tell me only what is true." I said I would. She said, "When you were dying, the dying century, did you know you would survive it?" I thought about that. I thought about my grandmother's grandmother, who had been a child during the worst of it, who had grown up in a camp on the edge of what used to be a city, who had told my grandmother stories that my grandmother told me in a low voice when I was small, stories that were too heavy for daylight but that she carried anyway because she said the dead deserved to be remembered even when it hurt. "No," I said, "we did not know." Aylin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is what none of us understood. We thought survival implied certainty, the belief that the outcome was survivable." She looked at me steadily. "You had no such belief." "We had stubbornness," I said. She almost smiled. It was a small movement, barely visible, but it was there. On the other side of the chamber, I could see Senior Delegate Orath speaking in a rapid undertone to two of his staff. He was not looking at me. That was its own kind of information. And then the door to the Arbiter's private anteroom opened, and a council aide came directly toward my platform. Thesov wanted to see me. Alone. The anteroom behind the chamber was small and deliberately plain. No crests on the walls, no holographic display, no gallery. A table, 2 chairs, and a light source. The kind of room where the things that actually settle disputes get discussed, away from the record and the cameras. Thesov was already seated when I walked in. He was alone. No staff, no aide, no secondary arbiter. His recorder pendant was dark, which meant nothing he said here was going to the conclave archive. I sat down across from him. He was old by any measure. Verk lifespans were long, and 60 years as arbiter meant he had been in this role since before I was born. His face was the particular kind of still that comes from decades of controlling exactly what you show and to whom. But his eyes were sharp, watchful, the kind of eyes that had seen enough situations to recognize when something genuinely new had entered the room. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. I let him look. I was not in a hurry. "Ambassador Osai," he said finally, "I have been presiding over this chamber for 60 years. I have overseen 47 formal inquiries of this type. I want to tell you what has never happened in 47 formal inquiries, because I suspect you already know, but I want to say it plainly." I waited. "No delegate has ever turned the tablet over," he said. "Not one. Some have negotiated the terms. Some have requested amendments. Some have wept, which is distressing for everyone involved. But no one has pushed the tablet back." "I did not turn it over," I said. "I just did not pick it up." He acknowledged this with a slight tilt of his head. The distinction is noted. There was a pause. Outside the anteroom walls, I could hear the muffled movement of the chamber in recess, 214 delegations in conversation, the specific noise of a system trying to process something unexpected. "Tell me," Thesov said, "about the dying century." I looked at him. "It is in the council's records." "The records contain dates and numbers," he said. "That is not what I am asking about." So I told him. Not the data this time, but the shape of it. The way it felt from inside, as best as I could reconstruct from everything my family carried, and everything I had studied, and everything I understood about what it does to a people when the floor disappears and no one comes. I told him about the specific quality of rebuilding, when you do not know if what you are rebuilding will hold. I told him about the way humanity's relationship with risk shifted permanently after the dying century, the way we became, as a species, constitutionally skeptical of the idea that someone else would solve our problems for us. "We are not aggressive," I said. "We built that second ship because we are afraid. but we are afraid in a particular way that is different from how the Council expects provisional members to be afraid. We are not afraid of you. We are afraid of being helpless. Those are different fears and they produce different behavior. Thesov listened to all of this. He was genuinely listening, I could tell, not waiting for me to finish so he could respond, but actually taking it in. When I stopped, he said, "The Harbor Light, your second vessel, what is it armed with?" "Standard defensive array," I said. "No offensive capability that the Resolution does not already have." "And your shipyards, what is the current production capacity?" I told him. I was honest. There was no point in being otherwise. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, "The Council is not a monolith, Ambassador. Orath is loud and the Dominion has resources, but they do not represent every voice in that chamber. There are delegations in the upper rings that have been watching Earth's situation for some time and have opinions that differ from the one you heard today." "Like the lure," I said. "Among others." He paused. "What I am going to tell you is not an official position of the Council. It is an observation from an old arbiter who has seen enough of these processes to understand where they tend to go wrong." I said nothing, I just listened. "The framework on that tablet," he said, "was written before this session began. It was written assuming you would accept it. The assumption was not unreasonable, given every precedent." He paused again. "You have disrupted the assumption. That has consequences in both directions. Orath's delegation will push harder, but the delegations that were neutral this morning will now be paying closer attention." "What are you telling me to do?" I asked. He looked at me steadily. "I am not telling you to do anything," he said. "I am telling you what the room looks like from where I sit, in case the view is useful." He stood up, I stood up. At the door he stopped and looked back at me. For the first time since I had entered that station, he said something that was not formal, not procedural, not designed to be recorded. "The sentence you said in there," he said, "the thing about extinction, do you believe it?" "Every word," I said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That is either the most dangerous thing I have ever heard in this chamber or the most useful." I met his eyes. "It is both," I said. Something moved in his expression. Not a smile exactly. The Verk don't smile. But something shifted, something small and real, and then he opened the door and walked back into the chamber. I stood in the anteroom for another moment before following. I thought, now he knows. And when he goes back to that chamber and looks at Orath's framework and looks at the tablet with the stylus beside it and looks at every delegation that is now watching this situation with new eyes, he will carry that knowledge with him. And that would have to be enough. Or it would not be. But I had said what was true and I had refused what was false, and the rest was going to happen with or without my permission, so I walked back through the door and took my seat on the platform. The recess ended 7 minutes later. I was ready. The chamber reconvened, with a different quality of air. I am not sure how else to describe it. The physical space was identical, the same 90-meter ceiling, the same concentric rings of delegates, the same central platform where I sat with the unsigned tablet in front of me. But something had shifted in the orientation of the room. I felt it the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. Not wind yet, but pressure. Orath did not stand first. That was the first signal. In the morning session, he had risen before Thesov finished speaking. Now he sat still, and I watched him not standing for long enough to understand that someone had spoken to him during the recess, and what they had said had been enough to make him recalibrate. Thesov called the session back to order in his formal phrasing, and then said something I had not expected. He said that the Council, in recognition of the complexity of the situation, was extending the session to allow for a broader discussion of the framework terms before ratification was requested. Broader discussion. Those were not words that appeared in any of the 47 precedents I had studied. Senior Delegate Orath's jaw moved. It was a small movement, the kind that belongs to being trying to absorb a procedural development they did not plan for. Then he composed himself and said, in measured language, that the Dominion was prepared to engage in good faith review of the framework terms, provided that Earth's delegate confirmed a commitment to the Mutual Defense Compact. I stood up immediately. Earth's commitment to the Mutual Defense Compact has never been in question, I said. What Earth requires is a compact that is actually mutual. The Harbor Light was built because Earth's requests for fleet expansion review were sitting in a committee that had not convened in 8 months. We followed the process. The process did not function. We solved the problem ourselves. I paused. Then I said, if the Council wants to discuss compliance, I am ready to discuss compliance. But compliance is a two-directional obligation. The room was quiet for a beat. Then the lure delegate, Aylin, raised her delegation's marker to signal a desire to speak. Thesov recognized her. She stood and said, in the precise and courteous phrasing that lure delegates always used, that her delegation wished to formally note that Earth's original fleet expansion requests were on record with the Council's administrative body, and that the review delay was documented. She said this as a neutral statement of fact. She said it clearly enough that every translation system in the chamber carried it without ambiguity. It was, in diplomatic terms, about the loudest thing she could have said. A second delegation marker went up. Then a third, not the Verk and not the observers, but 3 of the mid-tier delegations in the outer ring, species I had spent the last 2 years studying without ever expecting to hear speak on Earth's behalf. What followed was 2 hours of the most careful, most intricate, most exhausting conversation I have ever participated in. It was not a battle. It was more like a very complicated puzzle being assembled by beings who had different ideas about what the picture was supposed to look like, with me sitting at the center trying to make sure that whatever picture emerged, it had at least one piece that actually belonged to us. The Verk pushed for the fleet cap. We pushed back on the timeline. They proposed 30 years. I said 5 with a mandatory review at year 3. They said 20. I said 7. Thesov suggested 12 with a performance-linked review mechanism, and before I could respond, Aylin indicated her delegation's support for the suggestion, and just like that, the anchor had moved. The Harbor Light inspection was harder. Orath wanted Council-supervised weapons review with Verk inspectors. I would not accept Verk inspectors. I said I would accept a joint inspection team drawn equally from 3 delegations, none of which could be the Verk Dominion or any species with territorial interest in the outer arm. Orath protested. Thesov looked at the gallery and asked for comment. The comment that came back was that my proposal was procedurally valid. Orath sat down. We went through the framework page by page. Not all of it. The administrative section stayed intact. The registration requirements I accepted with one modification. The Harbor Light would be registered retroactively, and the registration fee would be waived given the documented failure of the review committee. That clause was small. It cost the Council almost nothing. But it meant that on paper, Earth's construction of the second ship was being treated as an administrative irregularity rather than a willful breach. That distinction mattered enormously for every future negotiation we would ever have. The observer status application was not on the table, officially. But Aylin raised it anyway during a break in the framework review, addressing Thesov directly rather than the full chamber, and said that her delegation believed the prolonged delay in Earth's observer status review was relevant context for today's proceedings, and that the lure would formally support expedited review. Orath said that observer status was a separate matter. Thesov said that the arbiter agreed it was a separate matter, and that the arbiter was therefore directing the administrative body to process the application as a separate matter on an expedited timeline. I did not smile. I kept my face completely still, but something warm moved through my chest and I let it quietly where no camera could see it. By the time the revised framework was drafted, the session had run 4 hours beyond its scheduled close. The chamber was tired. Some delegates had clearly been receiving regular communications from their home governments and were managing competing pressures. Oreth looked like a being who had arrived expecting to deliver a verdict and had instead spent a day negotiating with a species that was not supposed to have a strong hand. We had not had a strong hand. We had had one sentence and everything behind it. Thesov presented the revised framework for ratification. I read it carefully, all 32 pages of the new version, sitting on that central platform with every camera in the galaxy still running. I read it slowly because I wanted every delegation watching to see that I was reading it, that I was not signing anything I had not examined. Then I picked up the stylus. I signed it. Not because I had been forced to, not because I had run out of options, because this version was something I could live with, something Earth could live with. It was not perfect. It was not what we would have written if we had written it ourselves. But it contained room for us, actual room, space to exist in with some dignity and some agency, and that was more than the original tablet had offered. When I set the stylus down, the chamber was quiet for a moment. Then Thesov said, in formal phrasing, "The human species, represented by Ambassador Yara Osai, has affirmed the revised mutual cooperation and compliance framework. The Council so records." The gallery began to move. Some delegations were already preparing to leave. Others were grouping in clusters for the post-session conversations that were where a lot of the real work of the Council actually happened. Aylin caught my eye from across the chamber. She gave a very small nod. I returned it. Oreth did not look at me. That was fine. Some bridges get burned and that is not always a loss. I gathered my datapad and my folder. I stood up from the chair on the central platform for the last time. The stylus was still on the tray. I left it there. It had done its work. The shuttle back to Earth's docking bay was small and quiet. I sat alone in the passenger section and looked out at the Veth Conclave station receding behind us, its vast form turning slowly against the backdrop of open space. The station was enormous. It had been built over centuries by species far older and more advanced than us, and it hummed with the accumulated weight of thousands of years of galactic civilization. We were a scratch on the edge of all of that, provisional, junior, new. The message from Earth's Joint Council arrived before we had cleared the docking corridor. Director Lin's name was at the top. The message was 4 sentences. Ambassador Osai, we watched the full broadcast. We are simultaneously furious and deeply grateful. Please explain everything, and please never do that again. I read it twice. Then I laughed. It started small and then it got bigger. And then I was sitting in that small shuttle passenger section, laughing hard enough that my ribs ached. And I did not stop until there were tears in my eyes, the good kind. The kind that come from the release of something you have been holding for a very long time. Outside the viewport, the stars were there. The same ones I had looked at from my quarters on the station the night before. The same cold, clear, entirely indifferent lights scattered across the dark. They looked different now. Not smaller, not closer, not warmer. Just more hours. I wiped my eyes and opened a new document on my datapad. I owed Director Lin an explanation. I owed the Joint Council a full report. I owed my government 3 days of debriefs and probably a formal hearing of their own about the whole stylus moment and the deleted apology. I would give them all of it. But first I sat for a few minutes longer and watched the stars, and I thought about my grandmother growing tomatoes in Kumasi without asking anyone's permission. I thought about the dying century and the 2.3 billion people, and the decade they called the Silent One, and all the names that got carved into memorials because the old forms could not hold the numbers. I thought about the species that had watched and recorded and expressed concern and done nothing. And I thought about the sentence. 22 words. We have been to the bottom of our own extinction and come back. So tell me, Arbiter, exactly what it is you think you can threaten us with. It was not a threat. It was not a boast. It was not diplomacy. It was just the truth, said plainly, in a room that had never heard it before. Every civilization in that council chamber had a story they called their founding, a moment that defined what kind of species they were going to be. The Lure had their solar event and the 60-day rescue. The Verk had their expansion wars and the treaties that ended them. The Observers had whatever their origin was, obscured and ancient and not shared with anyone. Today, Earth got one more entry in our story. Not the day we reached the stars. We had that one already. This was the day the stars learned to be careful with us. I closed the viewport shade, turned on the light above my seat,